towards what players want. They don't care how you open up your window or load your files or manage your memory. What they care about is, can I play the game? Does it run fast? Is it cool to play? Is it fun to play? Like I see a screenshot, I'm like, hell yeah, let me play that. Or yeah, stuff like that. Micromanaging things like how do players react to this mechanic, or when do I introduce this mechanics, and slowly introducing the game, keeping it fun and engaging, but not too easy and not too difficult. Like these spikes, if you avoid those, I tend to make games too difficult. But essentially, that's where a lot of my time was spent.
So in a way, if you don't mind me butting in here just really quick, in a way, you learned that you were focusing on stuff that you cared about as an artist and as an engineer, but not necessarily what the buyers of a product would care about. Meaning like the game runs great, the frame rate's good, there's solid menu options available to tweak the game and make it play well for them, right? So is that kind of what you mean?
Yeah, essentially that too. There's the typical, I don't know if you've played many HIO games, but you open up the game, it blasts your ears, and you go into the options menu if it exists, and there's no slider for sound. It's like, bro, you're kidding me? And then you go into your stupid Windows settings and turn this down.
Well, I bring this up because somebody commented to me, and I don't want to derail you here, but somebody commented recently that I was self-centered because I was talking about games as a product. And I actually believe thinking about games as a product is selfless because you're thinking about the audience. You know, they gave you money, so you need to give them something that works. You need to give them a product. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, maybe he misunderstood and thought it to be, let's say, I don't know how you say that, corporate speech, but it is a product in a way where you say, well, what matters is not me, what matters is what you think.
Glyphotic cultists hide among common folk now. Trust no one. Glyphotic cultists hide among common folk now. Trust no one. Glyphotic cultists hide among common folk now. Trust no one. Glyphotic cultists hide among common folk now. Trust no one. Glyphotic cultists hide among common folk now. Trust no one. Glyphotic cultists hide among common folk now. Trust no one. Glyphotic cultists hide among common folk now. Trust no one. Glyphotic cultists hide among common folk now. Trust no one. Glyphotic cultists hide among common folk now. Trust no one. Glyphotic cultists hide among common folk now. Trust no one. Glyphotic cultists hide among common folk now. Trust no one. Glyphotic cultists hide among common folk now. Trust no one. Glyphotic cultists hide among common folk now. Trust no one. Glyphotic cultists hide among common folk now. Trust no one. Glyphotic cultists hide among common folk now. Trust no one. Glyphotic cultists hide among common folk now. Trust no one. Glyphotic cultists hide
And if you decide that my game sucks, then it doesn't matter what my opinion is, because you have made up your mind.
Right,
And I guess, that's what you mean, right? You mean that the game is a product in the sense that enough people need to like it in order to play it. And that's where you base your decisions around. What you base your decisions around.
Yeah, so going back to your story, and I feel like I derailed you, so I apologize. I just wanted to get an idea of kind of, well, you were talking about low-hanging fruit, learning as a developer to focus on what matters as opposed to all this side stuff that you don't really need to focus on. I think that's where you were in your story. So if you want to go back to that.
Sure. I mean, what I learned is that I should have probably, like, there are some people in this, I guess, world that hate using editors. And I would say those people fall into the category of, I just want to code and then barely move my mouse around to do something like that. And there are people like that. And if I think about the big players that have done this before, which is Terraria, Stardew Valley, Celeste, those games have all been made in frameworks, and I should have probably done that too.
Glyphotic cultists hide among common folk
even
now.
Even if you are
Trust
not a person
no
that likes, and I've tried Godot recently, and I've tried Unity recently again, and I even tried Unreal, though I still don't enjoy the process at all compared to being able to have, I guess, control, and I can tailor the process perfectly to my. I can do it in an engine too. It just feels, oftentimes you are forced. You're going to use the Unity's animator system. That's how you do animations. Or you could get some, I don't know, I'm not a perfect Unity guy, and maybe a plugin, like people always tell me, oh, you could do it this way. But, right? You're doing it the default, I'm doing it the default way. Yeah. But spending time on opening up windows, making a sound like at one time I was adding sound samples together, which is just stupid. Like, why? And then I wrote a Vulkan renderer, which is way too much for a 2D game. Then I wrote an OpenGL renderer because I grew tired of it. Then shipping this OpenGL renderer is a nightmare, because OpenGL, for those that have done OpenGL, especially on other systems, it behaves differently on different systems depending on what the graphics card implements as a function. Like, it's a bit technical, but it's a nightmare. And then I even wrote another renderer, and all of this time is like, sure, you know a lot then, but it doesn't teach you.
Glyphotic cultists hide among common folk now. Trust no one. Glyphotic cultists hide among common folk now. Trust no one. Glyphotic cultists hide among common folk now. Trust no one. Glyphotic cultists hide among common folk now. Trust no one.
what is 5 minutes of fun? Someone starts the game, they get into the game for the first time, they get told to move left or right or use WASD. And then like Noita, for example, is really cool, where you barely have any tutorial, but you figure stuff out by just running around. And that's your 5 minutes of fun, because maybe you have like an innate mechanic of destroying a wall, and then they just destroy walls for 5 minutes.
Can I ask you really quick? I'm so sorry. Can I ask you what you mean by 5 minutes of fun? Because I know what you mean, but I want my audience to understand what that means, because I love that phrase, 5 minutes of fun. And it's so important. And I learned this idea from Tim Willits, who is, I think he's some C-level at Saber Interactive, which is the parent company of my publisher, 3D Realms. And he critiqued Twisted Tower, my game. He was like, he basically said, the 5 minutes of fun was not true. And I had to go in and scramble and fix it, right? So can you explain it really quick, and then we can keep going with your story?
Sure. That's bad though. Like, that's not good.
It hurt so bad, dude. It was like the worst summer of my life. And if he's watching, I appreciate him, because without him being so brutal, I wouldn't have had that urgency to make some changes, you know? And the game wouldn't be what it is today. And I also wouldn't have the understanding of what 5 minutes of fun means. So go ahead.
Well, let me try to explain it as good as I can, because like I'm no expert, but I would say 5 minutes of fun is you open up the game, and the first 5 minutes you spend in the game make you forget time in a way where you are immersed in the game, and there's absolutely the least amount of friction possible, so that the player has no way to complain and leave the game, because he moves the player in the game, or like the player moves the character in the game, and he hates it. That's the first friction, which cuts your 5 minutes into 10 seconds, and he's out the door already.
مرحبا.
Stuff like that.
كيف كان يومك اليوم؟
You spend most of your time on the first 5 minutes, and then you try to go to 30 minutes or 20 minutes. That's when you get your demo. It's what you do in the game that counts. You can time it or something. Like, I guess the best thing I could do is an example. You boot up your game. It's a tower defense game. The first thing it tells you is select the tower on the top right and put it on the map. Click play. And then it plays, and it gives you in the first minute, it gives you, oh, look, your tower has gained, or you have gained enough money. You could get an upgrade. That's how Bloons works, for example. And then, like, it keeps you engaged, spaced out enough, so that it's not overwhelming. You can only get one upgrade in the first
the beginning of knowledge,
or 2 minutes, 3
just
minutes.
To reassure you.
And then you get the upgrade, and the tower shoots 2 enemies all of a sudden instead of 1. So you get the sense of progression. It's not overwhelming, and you basically, you are busy learning the game, and you're forgetting time, and then 5 minutes already over. Cool.
Well, something, you know, like I've had people, and then we'll get back to your story, but this is an important point that I want people to realize. I've had
every kingdom standeth upon the corpse of something ancient.
The 5 minutes of fun idea was a thing.
Every kingdom standeth upon the corpse of something ancient.
In the sense that it's like, well, I want I respect my audience, and I want them to.
Every kingdom standeth upon the corpse.
Like Transformers comes out, and in the first
every kingdom standeth upon the corpse of something ancient.
To an audience member, because it's like
every kingdom standeth upon the corpse of something ancient.
But my pushback is, in a crowded market, like for example, restaurants. Everyone has a restaurant, and everyone's trying to sell their food, right? That's why you have appetizers. Number one, obviously they want to make extra money, but you want to give them a quick reward to let them know that their food is good, and let them know that the restaurant is good. In Steam, we're competing with 20,000 other games released every year, you know? And you've got attention spans that are tiny. You know what I mean?
Every kingdom standeth upon the corpse of something ancient.
I would say first minute. You know,
every kingdom standeth upon the corpse. Every kingdom standeth upon the corpse of something ancient.
Where when you spend $60 on a
Every
cartridge, you're
kingdom
gonna have to
standeth upon the
power
corpse
through the first
of something
20 minutes of
ancient.
the game because you paid the money and you can't really pick another game because that's the only game you have. You know, it's a different world now, and you have to play by the game. And the game is capture their attention immediately. It's unfortunate, but it's just the way it is. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I guess to add to that, sell the gameplay loop or get the gameplay, show the gameplay loop as fast as possible without overwhelming the player. I think
That's
a good example of this is also Vampire Survivors. You start with, I think, one character. You're going to choose one, go into a mission, and then you run around. You evade monsters, right? And then it gets you immediately in there. And then all of a sudden you get a level up and now you're hooked. It's like
That's
you
right.
get a chest and now you're playing for 10 hours.
That's right. And obviously you start to pump the brakes and you start to temper how much reward you give them. But at the beginning you want to, I don't know, you want to give them a little bit more than what they're going to get later on just to entice them. And so you, back to your story, you kind of had to figure that out, right? In making your game.
I don't remember where I heard the phrase 5 minutes of fun. Like, we watched a lot of videos on stream too. Somewhere I heard that, and to me it stuck with me because it's you can treat the development of your game as some sort of a checklist or a goalpost list where you want to hit certain goals, and you obviously start with the minimum viable product where you first you get your gameplay loop in order, right? What are you gonna do in a game? For example, what I like to always look at is a cool example that really showed to me that could be so easy was a game called Miglorn.
Yeah, super kind of obscure. You know, nobody really knows about it, I think. Yeah.
The cool thing is, a real civil engineer played the game.
Really?
And that's crazy. Yeah, and he didn't even, I think he didn't pay him. He didn't, maybe not even, as far as I know, he didn't even write him because he didn't think he'd had a chance, right? I wouldn't think I'd have a chance. And he played it, I think, because real civil engineer is like a guy that likes to build stuff and order stuff. Like, and in the game, Miglorn is essentially it's a very simple gameplay loop. You go out, you collect resources, you go back to your base, you use those resources to build defenses, you defend at night. Thronefall, essentially. Little bit more than Thronefall, but Thronefall. And for me, it's like, okay, you how do you say that? You gather, farm, build, defend, repeat. Maybe you didn't get a reward at night, which made me angry, but should have gotten a reward at night. But that's the gameplay loop. And so you define a loop, and then you work on the first 5 minutes when you have that in order.
Mm-hmm.
Then you work on 30 minutes. Now you have 30 minutes. That's a demo version. So that's how I learned to ultimately treat my game so that the players have the best amount of experience. And you're going to spend the most of your time in these first 30 to an hour to 2 hour. Like, you're always going to replay the beginning the most.
As a developer.
Yeah.
Yeah. What is the hack or the trick to avoid the 2-year chasing your tail and getting lost in the wilderness? Is it playtesting? Is that the solution that people need to be implementing so they can avoid that?
Yeah, I say that, but no, actually no. Yes. Yes. But it's a to-do list, essentially. Like a final to-do list with a date where you're going to be finished. And I got so lucky. I had the guy from Deep Rock Galactic Survivor. I don't know if you know the game. It's a somewhat big Vampire Survivors type game. Come into my chat. Asmongold played the game. It's like a really big game. Like they are on par, I think, even player numbers wise with Vampire Survivors.
Yeah, they have 23,000 reviews.
They're huge.
Very big, very big. Cool. Yeah, it looks awesome.
And the guy came into my stream and he told me, yeah, you got to write down a list of things, specific things that you need to do. And that could be, for example, add the fireball ability to the fire sword. That's like one thing. Write down everything that you need to get to your next demo. And then in a notepad, for example, Like nothing fancy, no, whatever. Like you don't need special products for this. You can just write it down in editor, and then you going to work on that list. But before you work on the list, you set a date. You say, I'm going to be done by the end of March 2025. And then you work on the list, and you keep that date in mind. And if you're off by 2 weeks, which you will be pretty sure, or a month, then you extend the duration, but you set yourself another deadline. You need that pressure, that deadline to get the stuff out there. And then when you have that done, when you have the next version out, that's when you playtest again. And so it's like this cycle of getting specific things that you need to do written down, working towards this goal, and playtesting, and then repeating the process until you are confident that, okay, now I'm getting towards the release. Or now maybe you playtest through the playtest feature on Steam, which you should, because the demo version on Steam is actually really important because of the wish lists and emails. It's like a launch of the game. They send out emails to everyone that wishlisted the game. If you have 10,000 wish lists, that's going to be 10,000 emails sent out by Steam to potential people that play the game. That's so much feedback. So you're probably going to playtest with the playtest feature on Steam, where they can opt in. And then after that, you prepare your demo. And then usually after that demo usually is conjunction with Steam Next Fest. Then you go for the release.
Okay. If I told you to make a task list for building a yacht, could you do that?
A boat look cool. I don't know.
See, that's the problem with this task list. Is that,
I know.
You know, when it's your and this isn't me pushing back randomly for no reason. I'm thinking about the audience, because they're sitting here going, making an indie game, especially when you want to push a genre forward, meaning you're adding additional, like kind of like you were trying to do. You're trying to make something bigger than just a repeat of another game. Creating a task list with milestones is so foreign. Like, it's like, what do you spend your time on, and in what order do you do things?
Whatever you want.
That's the devil's advocate argument for you, which is maybe those 2 years were necessary for you to discover what the task list was.
Yeah, that is unfortunately the truth. You're going to, even if you try to make a task list, you're probably going to make these mistakes too. Because mostly everyone does it, unless you're either super smart or super lucky. Like the developers of Backpack Battles, was funny. They got asked, I don't know who interviewed them, but they got asked by the interviewer, well, what do you want to, how do you tell people to make a game? And like the wife said, or the girlfriend, she said, yeah, make a game as big as possible, make all the mistakes, spend 5 years making it, and then never release it. And then the guy said, no, actually, I was going to say the opposite, make small games. And so like, that's where, for me, there was this validation in, well, everyone has the same problem. We want to make small games. We know that we should make small games. But then we make these mistakes, and oftentimes it could also be that what I think is holding many back in me too, which is I want to make the best possible thing, and I don't want to disappoint players when I bring out something that is not done yet. Yeah. And you only really learn to avoid or to ignore that feeling when you have done or when you have released things often enough to where you get to a point like, okay, I know what I need to do to get to minimum viable product, and I'm going to do that. But even if you don't have any experience, what I would do if I had no experience, what I would do now is I pick something that works, let's say Vampire Survivors, and I change one thing. And since I know Vampire Survivors, I know what I need to implement for Vampire Survivors. But I'm going to cancel out the things that make it too difficult for me. So I remove the cards that you can select in the beginning. I remove the million different heroes. I only have 3 heroes. I remove, they had so many collaborations with different things. Like I strip it down to the most basic concept. I write that down, and then I'm going to add my twist in the sense of Deep Rock Galactic Survivors, destructible walls. And so then I only really need to engineer this destructible walls part, everything else is basically done for me, and I don't need to have experience in game development. I just need to figure out was Vampire Survivors built. I'm gonna play Vampire Survivors. Okay, also I need this. I could still make a list. That doesn't mean that it'll take 5 months only. Maybe it'll take you a year or longer, but at least you have like this list from an example. And that's essentially how Thronefall also kind of started, right? They started with something a concept that was known, which is defend your base, defend your castle. That's not the first thing ever. And then because that works, and then you build your own thing. We make it minimalistic. That's our thing.
Yeah. So back to your story. Let's move to launch if you want to, unless there was more about your story you wanted to share. But your launch day was particularly interesting. But go ahead.
I don't think there was too much. The only thing that I realized was that the closer I got to launch, the more YouTube and Twitch started picking up, because it's just an exciting thing for someone being basically as content. It's interesting content. Making a game day 502 is boring, but game releasing in 2 days is really cool. It's like, what's it gonna do now? And that ultimately was the reason why the game was so successful, is because I got lucky in a sense that I had people care about me and the game and the journey, that they pushed the game so much buying it on release. I streamed to both YouTube and Twitch for a long time, and I think on launch on Twitch, I would have to check, but I think it was 600 viewers. And then on YouTube, I spiked to 1,000, which is, I have never seen these numbers before. And that
these are live streaming viewers?
Live streaming viewers, concurrent viewers, yeah.
Yeah, that's good.
That gave me multiple thousand views exactly at the time when I needed it. And that ultimately then catapulted the game immediately to 100 players, which made me super happy. But I was expecting that. Like, I don't want to sound, I don't know.
No.
I was expecting that from previous numbers, from previous demo versions, and judging by the amount of viewers I had, by the amount of subscribers I had gotten. Okay, so it's got to be about 100. But then all of a sudden it got to 200. That's where I was really happy, because then Steam picked it up. It went down to 100, went down to 90, and then Steam picked it up, new and trending. And that's ultimately the reason why the game got, for me, it was successful when it hit 32K in the first 30 minutes, because that meant for me, I was able to make a new game. It was a big talking point between me and my wife. Yeah. Because, well, this journey, we talked about engines and learning to build games, but what oftentimes is not talked about, how do you finance yourself? How do you, especially when we had a family at that point, a little daughter, and we were married for, I think, 2 years at that point. Let me check the ring. Yeah, it's about 2 years.
Great, man.
We were married for a long time, and she was like, well, we need the money. We're losing money. Like, she had 10K saved up, and I had barely anything saved up, and we were scraping by less and less and less money each month. And that was for us such a substantial moment, because it removed all of the pressure and arguments we had at that moment, that we felt so happy. And that like, she was so happy that she started, jumping around, and I couldn't believe it. And that then got clipped. Like, I didn't tell anyone to clip it. Like, there were people that say that, but these guys are stupid. Like, there's always going to have some idiots on the internet. But essentially, that got clipped by a certain someone, and he uploaded that to Reddit live stream fails. And I got lucky that it didn't get removed, because it technically broke their guidelines. Like, there was no name of the streamer in the title, but it blew up from there. Like, then Penguin Zero played it, which is a huge idol of mine. Like, I was like dreaming of this guy playing my game. I was dreaming it, like, and he did. So lucky. And that's when it just went viral. Like people came into my chat, they started asking me questions, and big guys made videos, clips. I couldn't keep up, but that's then when the game popped off.
Yeah. So you're saying that the reason why you guys were jumping up and down and you were crying is because you knew what was at stake. It's not that you're like, yay, I get to buy a yacht. It's more like, we don't have to worry anymore about what's coming.
Yeah, I mean, I was financing my last three monthly rent payments through the stream. I had to do a donation goal because we didn't have the money. If at any point I could not get the donation goal to hit $1,500, I was going to have to lend myself money, which I didn't want to do.
Yeah.
And for us, it was basically this now, or I get a job, because there was no other choice. I need money. We need to pay the rent. It's also a thing about fatherhood, something that I guess happened when we had Zoe, is that you are supposed to be the person that provides, and if you can't do that, in my eyes, you're a loser. And that's how I was seeing myself for the longest time. Because, well, you can't buy your daughter clothes. You can't buy food. I always had to check the bank account. Do we have enough money to buy food? And that really pushed me to try my best and to get everything in order. It was actually the reason why I changed the entire game. I think it was 2 weeks or 1 week before launch. The characters were oranges. They were not human-like characters. And I always struggled with appeal in the game. Like, the game did not look from the outside like something that people wanted to play. Like, who wants to experience themselves commanding an orange? I don't know.
It's so important, dude. It's so important.
Yeah.
So you call that appeal, visual appeal. And that is correct. That is correct. It's also something like a visual hook, in the sense that you're not going to be interested when you first see the ability to play as an orange. And also, there's no wish fulfillment there. Who wants to play as an orange? But you changed it, right, to protecting an orange tree. Is that what it was? Or
yeah, I mean, I still don't understand this concept 100%, because brotato works, and as far as I know, that's just a freaking potato. So, I don't know how that works.
Well, is brotato, is it surviving off of, or is it successful because of wish fulfillment? Because a lot of games do really well because of wish fulfillment, right? Like, for example, David Whaley's game, which is called We Harvest Shadows. It's not out yet, but the wish fulfillment is caring for your acreage, buying land and taking care of your land. That's the dream, right? Whereas brotato, I don't know if brotato is successful because of wish fulfillment as much as it is just really juicy combat in gameplay, So, but yeah, to your point, you don't always need wish fulfillment, I think.
Yeah, it's something I'm still learning, and I'm going to try to absorb as much as possible, ask as many people as I get to about this, because I think that's where so many people also go wrong. They think that they built some cool mechanic, and in my opinion, I had built a cool mechanic of these items, putting them on characters. Like, it's essentially like teamfight tactics, but you have this endless possibility. It's not like in Bloons you have 3 upgrades and that's it, or 4 upgrades and you choose 2 out of 3 lanes. You still have some options there, but you can't say, oh, I'm going to add 20 projectiles to this tower because I can, right? And that concept is really enticing for many people because it does not limit you, and it's interesting, and you can expand upon this a lot. But the way you present that is very important, especially when all people can see is a screenshot or maybe a short clip of your game. How do you show that? And that's been something that I've been struggling a lot with, and others do this so well. And I still don't maybe Potato is just cool combat and being able to move around and have all of this stuff happening at the same time while shooting 10 million guns around. That's the cool thing. And that's all you need.
Yeah.
And then it doesn't matter if it's a tomato, potato, banana, or whatever, right?
Yeah. I think sometimes a game is successful because of or not success. There's a difference between successful and good, right? There's good games that aren't successful in the sense that they didn't go viral, but they're good games, right? I think if this game was called The Potato Shooter, it would be a good game. But I think it's successful because of the name Brotato. I think it's just
Brotato is a cool name.
That right there is, like you were talking about, presenting. It's like, yes, mechanically it might not be profound, but the presentation of that mechanic with that very strong hook is what captures people and creates 30,000 overwhelmingly positive reviews. Wow. Like, that's incredible. And I think it's probably just because it's funny. So if you don't mind me going back to this concept of being a father as an indie game developer, I would say the majority of the people listening right now are either approaching fatherhood or are fathers, just judging by the age and also the gender.
25 and 35, maybe.
Yeah.
For me too.
And so many people dream of making indie games, but they're also a father, and they do. I do agree with you, and I'm not sure if you were saying it in jest, but I do agree that if you can't provide, you're a loser to a degree. It's like, that's your job. You know, that is the thing you're supposed to do. And you shouldn't have kids if you can't do that. And you, like, most people should be able to provide for their kids in any way necessary. I mean, sweeping the streets or being a garbage man, no matter what it takes, that is my number one job. So I agree with you. Isn't it hard though to make indie games? Like, would you keep making indie games if you were scraping by?
Yeah. I would do
Would
it like
you
this.
personally?
Yes, like, but the I guess it's called priority list is there, which is Zoe's first, like my daughter is first, and providing for her first, meaning, okay, if I have to get a job, how much do I need to provide so that I can make my games on the side? Because that's how I started. When I had a job as a web developer, and I would wake up at 4, I would do 2 to 3 hours of coding, then I'd go to the gym, then I'd shower after the gym in the gym, and then you go to work, you get home at 5 or 6, and then you're there for the family. And usually you don't need to be there at 4 a.m. because they're gonna be sleeping. And so then you just, that's what I would do then. I would still make games because I really love making games. I have big, I don't want to say ambitions, but my lifelong goal is to make a game like Gothic 1, which is what I played as a kid. It's a series that was made by a German developer called Piranha Bytes. And these guys recently had to close down, which sucks. I want to make a game like Gothic 1, a small, but let's say compact, because that's something that's been lost in my opinion. RPG game where, yes, you have an open world, but the open world is so compact and filled with stuff that a smaller team or person can make it alone or with the help of an artist and maybe one additional person, because you don't need to have this vast, empty Elden Ring, Witcher 3. You need a horse, you need teleports, and the only reason you need that is because the game's so big, takes too long to run, it's boring. But if you have a compact world, and especially Gothic 1 did that very well, and Gothic 2 too, then you don't need that. And that's what I want to do. That's my lifelong goal. And I'm currently, I see myself as learning or getting ready for that step. So that doesn't take 10 years, but maybe 4 years, like not that long. I don't want to, 4 years is a long time.
I know, dude, you know, I don't want to discourage you, but that's what I said with my first game. I spent 5 years on it and it made good money. And I said, I'm never doing that again. And then I kept doing it again and again and again. And so my third game, right now I'm almost at year 5, I believe. And I sit here dreaming, and maybe you do too. You dream about, okay, this is the process for my next game. And it's going to be compact, like you said, and tight and focused. And my hope is that you and I both learn, like, what's unnecessary in game development, so that we don't chase our tails like we did in the last game, you know. And I think for me, I've found my voice, and I found that my voice is what sells my games. So for me in particular, I know that story and mood are the things that people care about with my games. And if I try and focus on some crazy, interesting mechanic, that's not my skill set. And that's what I tried to do with my last game. With my last game, I tried to be someone I wasn't. And now I know that, no, I just need to focus on what I'm best at. And I'm getting too old to be unique at this point. I just need to do what I understand and know. And so I think with you, you know, I wonder if there's something you've learned about Tangy that's like, this is what I'm good at, and this is what I need to focus on. You know, I don't know.
Just a quick question though, about your game. I recently saw.
Welcome to Lisa
watch the video yet. I saw
Plan
like
3-6.
update on Twisted Tower.
A walk in the park
me,
is like
your game. I hope that's not.
if you're
something
looking
that
for a professional,
offends you, but
clear
for me,
African
your
voice.
game looks like Bioshock.
Great
The
narration.
moment I see a screenshot, like, okay, it's Bioshock, right?
Yep.
Is that intentional?
Yes.
Okay, that's good. And
Why do you ask? Curious.
No, because
It's a new
again,
world
like I was
innovation
doing, let's say research. I was trying to
One
figure
can't
out
grow by staying
why games are appealing. And then I was like, wait, so your game looks like Bioshock. There's probably a lot of appeal there. That's why people go and wishlist the game, right? And so that's essentially it. And like I'm trying to figure out, okay, so why is this game getting wishlists and my game is not? Okay, so
Exactly. The reason I was able to get wishlists is use
Hey,
the word
thanks for
lucky with your game. I'm lucky that I have an audience. I mean, that's why my games get wishlists, or at least now. In the past, I had to get wish lists. I think Pinstripe, my first game, I think it launched with
Alchemy is balance.
16,000 wish lists.
Too much
And I
light
didn't have an
blindeth
audience then.
as surely
And
as
that was
darkness.
tough.
Okay.
You know, that was tough to get there.
That's a lot of wish lists.
Is it?
Good actions
Yeah.
give strength to ourselves.
I had 700 wish lists after 2 years, and like one player at most in the gym was like, oh, that's not gonna
Alchemy
happen.
is
What'd you launch
balance.
with, if you don't mind
Too
me
much
asking?
light
I
blindeth
launched
as
in
surely
with
as
5K.
darkness.
I got 1K in Steam Next Fest, and then I tried
Alchemy
pushing,
is balance.
again, YouTube streams and Twitch streams, and I put up a link every stream. Go wishlist the game, and I ended up with 5K or something.
Yeah,
but not good enough to be in popular and upcoming.
Without
But
dude, you launched in like
Airplanes
it blew
climb
up,
the sky.
and that
Yeah,
means
good
that you
copy.
weren't lucky. That means, I mean, that means that you made a good game.
I think the game's good. Like, it's fun. Yeah.
Yeah.
Honestly,
I'm sitting here.
Alchemy is balance.
Where
To
talk about
alchemy
privilege.
is balance.
I know I'm privileged.
Too much
I
light
know how to talk
blindeth
to a camera, and I know
as
how to
surely as
pretend to be
darkness.
Cool and interesting. But the game, my suspicion about my game.
You just found the voice you've been looking for. Clear, powerful, unforgettable.
From my audience, from my people who like Thomas. I don't know why people like me, because I think I come across.
Alchemy
cocky.
is balance.
People like me.
Too much light blindeth
like me,
as surely
and
as
they're gonna leave a
darkness.
positive review, and then what's going to happen is this is what the Constantine developer told me, or not Constant.
gamers are gonna come.
Alchemy
Gamers
is
are gonna
balance.
come, and they're gonna go,
Too much
"This
light
isn't
blindeth
Bioshock."
as
And I'm
surely
gonna go,
as darkness.
I know it's not.
Alchemy
I
is
know
balance.
It's much smaller
Too
than
much
Bioshock,
light
and I couldn't
blindeth
afford
as
to make
surely as
Bioshock, you know?
darkness.
But that's okay. That's okay. And the reason I brought all this up is I just wanted to say, I don't know if
Alchemy is
audience-driven
balance.
game development is a
Too much
problem.
light blindeth
Meaning,
as surely
Cakes
as
makes
darkness.
games for his audience. Big deal. That's not luck. That's a strategy. That's how I honestly think that that's the future of game development. 20,000 games released a year. let's start building our own little islands, our own little ecosystems of players who like our games and our styles, and they support us during development, and then we release games to that audience.
Alchemy is balance.
And I don't see that as
Too much light
a
blindeth as
strategy.
surely as darkness. Alchemy is balance. Too much light blindeth as surely as darkness. Alchemy is balance. Too much light blindeth as surely as darkness. Alchemy is balance. Too much light blindeth as surely as darkness. Alchemy is balance. Too much light blindeth as surely as darkness. Alchemy is balance. Too much light blindeth as surely. Alchemy is balance. Too much light blindeth as surely as darkness. Alchemy is balance. Too much light blindeth as surely as darkness. Alchemy is balance. Too much light blindeth as surely as darkness. Alchemy is balance. Too much light blindeth as surely as darkness. Alchemy is balance. Too much light blindeth as surely as darkness. Alchemy is balance. Too much light blindeth as surely as darkness. Alchemy is balance. Too much light blindeth as surely as darkness. Alchemy is balance. Too much light blindeth as surely as darkness. Alchemy is balance. Too much light blindeth as surely as darkness.
I mean, do you know what I'm talking about there?
Yeah, I see what you mean. Though I gotta be honest, I kind of still did the game I wanted to make.
Oh, sure. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about your audience supports the game as you make it, and then they show up and review it for you, and potentially even leave biased reviews. What's that?
Yeah, biased, and they were very positive. Yeah,
of course they were.
I was at 99%. The first, I don't know, 100, 200 reviews, 300 reviews.
Yeah.
And then the gamers came. It's like, game's too difficult, or I hate that, or was this? It's like it dropped down, but it kind of leveled at 91, 92%.
And they came in so hard and so fast that they even gave you a DMCA claim. What is that? Was it them or was it some other game? Do you want to talk about this?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's my own fault. First and foremost, like, this is entirely my fault and could have been avoided if I was not lazy. Essentially, I wanted to have a goblin in the game, and I don't even know what I was using before, but I wanted to have a goblin, and I tried drawing a goblin, and I sucked. So I went to Google, typed in goblin pixel art, and then clicked through a couple of images, and then I landed on the goblin that was originally the goblin of the game that actually inspired my game. It's kind of funny. And so by clicking through YouTube images and then clicking on similar images, I saw this goblin and I was like, I like that design, and I made it too similar. So I took literally some pixels they had, and I did the same order of pixels. And pixel art is pixel art, right?
It's
you
very
put 3
simplistic.
pixels here, then you put pixel there. It's the same, but there's not much room for interpretation.
I know.
And I made it too similar. And that base goblin is what is shown in the trailer. And I think either it was an AI that picked up on the trailer, and then because AI just scours the internet, sees something similar and tells them, or it was the fact that it went viral. But if we are now past the viral curve, it's slowing down, or it's slowed down and found a baseline. I think it must have either been AI or they just saw it by chance, and then they were like, yo, you can't put our goblin into your game. And then they DMCA striked the game through Steam. The only thing that I would have loved to have the opportunity to do is, like, you could have contacted me first. That's what Steam says as well. Try to resolve it before doing a strike. and but I take it. It's fine.
Alchemy is balance.
I'm losing
Too much
money
light
now,
blindeth
but it is
as
true.
surely
I
as
did
darkness.
not make my goblin look too different enough from what I used as inspiration to draw it.
Yeah.
I still think using Google as inspiration is a good thing, because oftentimes we don't know how to draw certain things. And it's literally Adam C. Eunice is a big one. Like, he uses references to, everyone uses references. However, you gotta do your own thing. And that's something I learned from this.
I think, my opinion is, I think it's truly an honest mistake. And the reason why is because you're not an idiot. You know that copyright is a thing, right? So it's not like you're like sitting here scheming, how do I steal this goblin and nobody knows? You know, it's not that. You probably got too excited, or too inspired. Like for me, I woke up in a cold sweat one night when I realized that the silhouette of my game's Twisted Tower castle, which is the castle you climb, it was too similar to Disney. And I realized, oh my word, you don't want to get hit by Disney. So if you look at you look at the tower silhouette, the 3D version is fine, because you're looking at it from the base and it almost looks like something out of Batman.
Alchemy is balance. Too much light blindeth as surely as darkness. Alchemy is balance. Too much light blindeth as surely as darkness.
Glyphotic cultists hide among common folk now. Trust no one.
Alchemy is balance. Too much light blindeth as surely as darkness. Alchemy is balance. Too much light blindeth as surely as darkness. Alchemy is balance. Too much light blindeth as surely as darkness.
like
Around the middle of the 15th century, knights right the way across Europe, many of them switched from this type of helmet to this type of helmet here. And we're not going to be looking in this video at exactly why they switched from the great bassinet to the sallet right the way across Europe, but instead we're going to be looking at one particular point related to vision. Hi folks, Matt Eaton here, Scholar Gladiatoria. Now, many of you will know that I like to do things in armour, and I love armour, and one of the common types of helmets that you will see in 15th century historical artwork, or indeed in modern reenactment, is the sallet. Now, before anyone says the bottom of your face is exposed, well, these are usually worn with a bever, okay, which protects the bottom half of the face. So they have two separate pieces, one essentially that protects the top half of the face up here, and a second piece which protects the bottom half of the face. So this makes them very versatile helmets, because obviously you can take the bever off, and then you've just got a helmet that protects the top of your head. You can put the visor up, or if it's got a fixed, not all of them have a raising visor here, you can tilt it back on your head and look underneath like that. And in fact, if we look in, you know, German and Swiss artwork, for example, often we find they don't have a separate visor, but they're just going to tilt them back on the head. And you walk around like this, and then if people start shooting things at you, then you can tilt it down and you're straight into using it as a normal sallet. So in the 15th century, it was very common for knights and also common soldiers as well to start adopting these sallets. But knights and men-at-arms, we should more correctly call them, very often switched from these big, cumbersome great bassinets, which offer huge amounts of protection, to this sallet. And they're obviously very different types of helmet. Now, this is a really big topic, potentially, and we're not going to look at why exactly they switched from these to these in countries like England and Spain and France and Italy, but we are going to look at one particular detail of vision. Now, the first thing to say, of course, is both of these helmets can be worn with an open face, and in fact certain types of sallet didn't even have a visor on them or any facial protection at all. They were just open-faced, and I often wear an open-face sallet myself in a reenactment context, although I wouldn't want to do that if people were shooting arrows at me, but open-faced, it really doesn't make any difference. And even if you've got a massive great bassinet or an earlier houndskull, if the visor is raised at this point, there isn't any difference in the vision whatsoever. You can see everything that you could normally see in usual life. But when the visors are down, it becomes a very different story. Now, on a fundamental level, when you look at these two helmets next to each other, you will notice that this one has vision slits around here, and it also has a lot of what are commonly called breaths, but they're more than that. I'll come back to that in a second, down here. So this has more perforations in the visor than this does. Now, obviously, I'll just put the great bassinet down for a second. Obviously, normally with a sallet, you'd be wearing a bever down here, which doesn't really interact with your vision very much. It depends how high up it comes, actually. It can do, depending on the bever, but usually they finish around nose height. But you'll notice that most sallets, not all, later in at the end of the 15th century and the 16th century, we do get sallets with perforations here, but most of them are a solid plate across here and either one or sometimes divided slit here. So theoretically, you would look at this and you think, well, this has only got one slit, whereas the great bassinet must be absolutely awesome to see through because you've got so many holes. Now, on a basic level, that can be true. However, here's an interesting thing, and this is the main point of the video. There is a lot to be said here about the proximity to the face, to the eyes. Okay, now you don't need a helmet to try this for yourself. So take your fingers and make a little slit like this, and if you put it close to your eyes and look through, you can see most of what you would normally be able to see, okay, through that slit. But the further it gets away from your eyes like this, the narrower and narrower and narrower your field of vision gets. Now, an interesting detail of sallets is they sit quite close to the face, very close to the face in fact. And if I just pull this visor down here, you'll notice that usually the brow ridge up here is really only just, you know, maybe 1.5 centimeters away from my forehead. That means that the top level of this slit, even though the bottom usually projects a little bit further forward of that, the slit itself is very close to my eyes. So despite the fact that I only have one slit, as I say, sometimes it's two slits, but I only have one vision slit, it is close to my eyes, and therefore my vision, although I do have a blind spot down here, so for example, I can see everything up to about that level and down to there and out to, well, almost probably about 100 degrees out there, I do have a bit of a blind spot here. Now, what's interesting is when you get used to fighting in helmets, most helmets have a bit of a blind spot around here, and you need that for protection. We'll come back to that topic in a second. But you do get used to just moving your head up and down to see different heights. So whereas normally with an open face, you just move your eyes up and down, with a helmet on, usually you have to move the head up and down, or if you can't, if it's connected to your breastplate, like with many great bassinets, for example, you tilt your body slightly. But nevertheless, you look up and down in order to see things at different heights, because you do have a blind spot here. Now, with the great bassinet, what's interesting is you might think, well, this doesn't have that blind spot because it's got all of these holes. But actually, you have this hard barrier just underneath here, which is very important. Again, I'll come back to protection in a second, which does create the same effect. So you do have a blind spot just under the main vision slits here. You can see through those holes, but nevertheless, with both of these helmets, you end up tilting up and down to see different height things. But the important point is that this is much further away from the face. If you look at the projection of the visor of the sallet, this sallet is not that far away from the end of my nose, whereas the great bassinet is miles away from the end of your nose. So because the visor and the vision slits are further away, it's got that narrowing effect. So the fact that this is full of holes and this isn't full of holes are connected partially by the proximity to the face. The fact that this is closer to my face means I don't need those extra holes to see through, whereas with a visor like this, or a houndskull bassinet, an earlier version of the bassinet, you know, with the pointy nose, because they're much further away from the face, you need to have more holes in it to see through it, because the vision slit is further away from your eyes. Now, let's connect these two things together and talk about protection. So one of the things that we find is if you're doing something like poleaxe fighting, or even any type of harness fectum really, so fighting in armor, generally speaking, the great bassinet is just about one of the most protective helmets you can get, because it protects the neck, it's rigid at the back, it's big and heavy so it can absorb blows, and importantly, the visor is far away from the face. So if, for example, you are likely to get hit in the face with one of these, doesn't even need to be a full swing, but just any type of forceful blow with a steel poleaxe in the face is freaking horrible. But I can tell you, with a helmet like this, it's a lot more horrible than it is with a helmet like that. And the main reason, apart from the mass and the just general robustness of a great bassinet, is it's further away from your face. With a sallet, I have a potential opening here which can get knocked open between the bever and the sallet, and it's much, much closer to being smashed into my face than a great bassinet or a houndskull bassinet is. So fundamentally, for fighting on foot against heavy weapons, powerful weapons, the bassinet is my helmet of choice. And you could say, well, what about the close helmet or the armet? Well, again, they're quite close to the head, so usually they only have one vision slit. Okay, in the 16th century, some of them have more, but they have one primary vision slit, and that's quite close to your face. So they're almost like halfway between the great bassinet and the sallet. But fundamentally, you don't need all of the holes that you've got in this as you do with that to see. And an interesting byproduct. Now imagine, so we've talked about poleaxes, imagine you're having arrows shot at you. Well, here's an interesting thing. So just from the impact alone, this helmet is going to deal with those impacts great, but you've probably seen the arrows versus armor experiments, which my friend Todd has done. These holes can be a problem if people are shooting lots of arrows or crossbow bolts at you. because potentially they can find an opening. I mean, they could potentially go straight through a vision slit like that, but even these smaller holes, which they couldn't directly go through, but they could potentially force their way in through if they happen to land on one of those holes. Now, interestingly, while the sallet is less protective against heavy impacts from something like a lance or a poleaxe, it's actually got fewer openings, because if you've got the bever coming up inside here, this doesn't have any holes in it. You have only got a vision slit, which frankly, if you're walking into arrows, is quite easy to cover with your gauntlet, which is actually something we see in historical artwork, or even just tilting it downwards so that they hit there and they don't hit straight into the vision slit here. So the sallet is both less protective in one way and more protective in another way, but interestingly, despite only having one vision slit, can sometimes have better vision than certain types of bassinet. Finally, there are versions of the Great Bassinet which literally just have a grill on the front, and they're used for tournament purposes, and they are absolutely optimized for vision and breathing. So if you're going to be fighting tournament with perhaps certain types of poleaxes or wooden clubs, something that we see in René d'Anjou's tournament book, then they're fantastic. But the problem is you can't use them in war, because as soon as anyone shoots an arrow towards you, it's just going to go straight through the grill and into your face. Not to say we don't occasionally see them in artwork of war, we do, but usually you need a more enclosed face here. So there we go, two different philosophies, and maybe in the future I'll talk about how this applies to close helmets and armets, because it also applies to them. But fundamentally, you can either have a solid plate with one vision slit that's close to your face, or you can have a more protective, in theory, visor that's further away from your face and better for receiving heavy impacts, but it has to have more holes in it so that you can see what you're doing. I hope that's been illuminating. I have been Matisse, and I'll of course continue to be, and I'll see you back on the channel really soon. Cheers, folks.
Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.
Many people think that medieval peasants lived, worked and died in exactly the same place. Well, that's not actually true. They travelled a surprisingly large amount, and for all sorts of different reasons. Let me explain. Of course, most ordinary people did spend the majority of their lives in the same village. After all, 95% of the population were farmers, looked after their own land. If they were villeins, they worked the land for the Lord. If they were free, they worked their own land. Now, technically, if you weren't free, you needed permission from the Lord of the Manor to travel. But it seems like that was probably sought and given quite easily. It wasn't really that formally done. You could travel, especially to the local market, and sometimes quite a lot further afield. Now, if you were poor, didn't have a horse, didn't have a beast of burden, there's a fair chance that your travel was going to be on foot. And some people travelled from England all the way to the Holy Land, mostly on foot, a journey that would have taken months, if not years. Of course, roads in the medieval period were of very variable quality, as you might guess. There were Roman roads. The Romans, quite a few hundred years ago, had built about 2,000 miles of highway, incredibly high quality highway across England and some of Britain as well. And a lot of those were still in use. Some of those were looked after and maintained. Some of them were in really bad condition, and others are completely abandoned because nobody used them anymore, because they're not going anywhere that anybody wanted to go. So it's quite variable. Most medieval roads, though, were more like footpaths or bridleways, or what we call easements today. You had the right to travel along that road, that route, rather than it having a surface like we would imagine a pavement might be. So the surface itself was probably going to be, well, it was going to reflect the weather that you were travelling in. So if it was really rainy, it was going to be very muddy. And there are medieval rules that you were allowed to go off the main path if it was impassable, if there was an obstacle, if there was a vast lake of mud and you couldn't actually get through it. You were actually allowed to go all the way round on somebody else's land, including actually damaging their crops by way of circumventing the obstacle. And that was permitted by law. It's probably frowned upon by the farmer, but it was actually permitted by law. So travel was quite important, and enabling travel was very important for the medieval period. Now, how did you actually find your way? Because there weren't GPS systems like there are today. And today, let's face it, lots of people type in their destination and they just follow the GPS. The GPS tells them where to go, even when they're walking, but certainly when they're in the car. How do you get from village to Canterbury, let's say? Well, there are things called itineraries, which are basically lists of places you need to go in order. So what you would do is go from your village to the local town. You would know that route. You'd get to the town and then you'd say, which is the road to the next place I need to get to? And you take that road, and then you get to that place and you'd ask the locals, which is the road to place on your itinerary? And you'd follow that road. So you're sort of leapfrogging from location to location, possibly not even having an idea of the physical layout that we would from sort of satellite photos or modern maps. But it was actually a very efficient way of travelling because you used local knowledge to find out where you were getting to. And eventually you would take the Canterbury Road to get to Canterbury. Or, as they used to say, all roads finally lead to Rome. So you'd go along these highways and you'd eventually get to Rome if you wanted to, and then beyond. Even today, some of the roads are labelled with the destination they're going to. So for example, in Oxford, there is a road called London Road, which goes to London, and that same road becomes Oxford Street when you get to London. So if you get to London and you want to go to Oxford, you take exactly the same road, but from the perspective of London. So an awful lot of roads in England are still named after the destination. So it makes it quite straightforward. Now, how did you know you were on the right road? Well, sometimes there were road markers, there were crosses, there are markers on the ground telling you a certain distance to a certain place. Few and far between, but they were there, especially on the major roads. And there were places that it was expected you would stop. So medieval people, unlike fantasy adventurers, typically didn't really go and camp in the woods on their journeys. They typically went from A to B, stayed in a tavern or an inn, in a kind of way station. And so places that you went to were organised around travel. It was expected that you would stop in this place, and there were different values. You could have a very posh room if you wanted to, with clean sheets, or you could be sleeping basically in the tap room in the tavern, or in the stables in fact, or even in somebody's barn. It was expected that these sort of places were allowable for you to sleep in. Of course, when you travel in the medieval period, you're going to be meeting a whole cast of different fellow travellers. Obviously, pilgrims, people going to market, you've got mercenaries, you've got messengers, you've got people travelling for pleasure, yeah, just exploring. You'd have monks, you'd have people travelling on the business of religious houses, you'd meet soldiers as well, all sorts. You probably wouldn't actually be that vulnerable to being attacked though, because the roads in medieval England were, it appears, surprisingly safe. There obviously were criminals abroad, but not as many as you might think from television and Hollywood movies. They were actually relatively safe. I couldn't find many records of ordinary travellers being that worried about being attacked. Although people did tend to travel in groups, so maybe they weren't as safe as we might think. Possibly carrying knives and decent sticks meant that you were a bit more safe than might be today. Of course, people travel long distances on foot today. There are still pilgrimages done. Santiago de Compostela is still done by a lot of people, and there are pilgrim routes all the way along there. But you probably are not going to walk more than 15 miles a day. So going to Constantinople or beyond to Jerusalem, 20 miles a day, 10 miles a day, that was a lot of days walking. But it appears it was done often, at least once in a lifetime in the medieval peasantry. It was on a peasant's bucket list, if you like. It was something they had to do. And if Chaucer's tales are anything to go by, they weren't as devout as some people might have thought. You kind of were supposed to be being religious, but it was the journey that mattered. You were going to be surrounded by the company of other travellers, possibly people you'd met before, possibly complete strangers who became friends. You will be travelling a long way in a big group of people, and you would get to know them. You would be drinking with them, you would be having fun with them, you'd be getting cross and angry with them as well. And the Canterbury Tales are all about the different characters that went on pilgrimages. I think there's a fair chance that most of them weren't that pious. They were going on pilgrimage more as a holiday thing. They were probably pious when they got there, and turning up to a medieval cathedral when you'd only lived in the local village and the biggest house was the Lord of the Manor's modest manor house. If you went to see a medieval cathedral, it would have been spectacular. It would have taken your breath away. They still take your breath away today, even when we have high-rise buildings that are taller. There's something majestic about the medieval cathedral. And so even the ones that weren't pious, I think, probably had a bit of a rush of religious fervour. And of course, there were souvenirs as well. So you got to that cathedral, you wanted to prove that you'd been on pilgrimage. So, like today, you bought those souvenirs, tin badges, all sorts of things like that, possibly even relics. Because you could buy cheap relics. You could buy a piece of cloth that had been looked on by some saint. Probably wasn't, it's probably fake, but you know, it gave you a keepsake to take back with you and show to all the friends in the village that you'd been there. I love that idea, that the journey was the main thing. Yes, you were going to a destination, but you were also having the experience of travel. And remember, if you're traveling on foot, you're going very slowly, so you would see the world revealed to you. You would almost smell the changes. You would see the landscape change from one place to the other. And certainly if you were going on a major journey, you would actually see the plant life change. The language people spoke would change as well. And eventually you would get to a totally different climate. You might have gone from English, slightly rainy green fields all the way through Spain or all the way through Italy, eventually to the Holy Land and the deserts there and the very much hotter landscapes. So I think medieval journeys would have been as much about personal discovery as they were about getting somewhere as quickly as possible. In the medieval period, you generally had two options for travel, by water or by land. And by water, that's normally heavy goods, so things like stone, big barrels of wine and that kind of thing. But what if the river doesn't go where you want to go? Well, then you have to walk or ride. Again, it subdivides into two categories, more or less. Most people were going to be walking on foot. A few people with enough money might have a horse. They might ride the horse, or they might walk with their goods carried on the back of their horse. Maybe they had pack ponies, or maybe they had carts and that kind of thing. But broadly speaking, the roads were where it was going to be if you wanted to go to places that weren't on the rivers. Probably one of the reasons why most big cities in Europe are based on rivers, because that's where you could get your heavy goods. But nonetheless, walking. Now, how far can you go on foot in one day? Well, basically, it depends entirely on the road conditions, the quality of your health, I suppose, the quality of the landscape as well. But broadly speaking, most people talk about 10 miles minimum sensible walking speed if you're just pottering along, don't have heavy loads perhaps, and just enjoying the travel. 20 miles if you're going a bit more briskly. So somewhere between 10 and 20 miles. A forced march can go much further than that. A forced march can probably go up to 30 to 35 miles in a day, but you are going to need to be young, fit, probably a soldier, because somebody's going to have to be hassling you to travel that far. And you're going to be quite tired at the end of it and footsore unless you're very, very fit and healthy. So on foot, you're probably best to think about 10 to 20 miles in a day. On horseback, estimates vary, and of course long distance riders can go many, many miles in a day. They can go 50 or 60 miles in a day, or even more sometimes. But I've experienced horse travel at a more sedate speed, and that usually gets you between 20 to 30 miles in a day, and you'll get to your destination much more comfortably than walking. As things started to urbanize around the 11th century, people started to charge tolls for crossing bridges. That was normally a penny per person. It was normally about a penny for a horse. It was normally a penny for a cow. It was less than a penny for a sheep. I think sheep, it varies. The data doesn't seem to be completely clear, but sheep were either half the price of a cow or a horse, or a quarter of the price of a cow or a horse. So somewhere around 25 to 50% of a penny. I presume you're going to have a flock with you of 10 and you have to pay that much. Merchants with carts that were laden down were charged substantially more as well. So they might be charged 12 pennies to enter into a city at the gate itself. And that would also depend on what they were carrying. So if they were carrying wine and spices, they'd have to pay quite a lot more. Silk as well was charged dramatically more than goods like linen or wool. So there was a definite policy of charging an appropriate amount of money for the goods that were coming into the town. Now, whether people actually declared those goods and how thorough the guards were at checking whether you were smuggling silk or spices, I don't really know. My guess is there were bribes taken sometimes to allow people to go through, but possibly not. Possibly everybody just, it was a cost of doing your job. You had to pass through and pay the taxes as you went. And I suppose it was for the greater good, in that the bridges were maintained and the roads were kept, not exactly in good condition, but in less bad condition. It meant there was some money to go towards that kind of thing. So travel was fairly expensive depending on where you wanted to go. If you wanted to go to lots of different places and you wanted to go through those towns, you might be paying a bit of money to go into each place as you went through it. So chances are you wouldn't go into a town unless you needed to. Now obviously you might need to cross a bridge, so you'd have to pay the bridge toll. The Roman Empire built a substantial road network across the island of Britain, some of which was still in use in the medieval period, others had been almost completely abandoned. The places that were in use, like Watling Street and the Fosse Way, actually went somewhere that medieval people wanted to go. So whilst the roads weren't maintained in the same way they would have been under the Roman occupation, they were still better than a lot of the other roads. Some Roman roads just didn't go where anybody wanted to actually travel, so they got abandoned and overgrown, and in some cases they got quarried away, because there's a phenomenon in the medieval period of medieval people just using old ruins as a resource, as a quarry. If you saw something that wasn't in use, didn't necessarily seem to belong to anybody, well, you take those Roman paving slabs and you use it to build your cow barn. So a lot of literal destruction of ancient ruins happened because people wanted to build farm buildings or houses, which I suppose you can't blame them necessarily, but it is a bit of a shame. A lot of roads, though, in the medieval period were roads of use. They were desire lines. Some of them were ancient. Some of them predated the Roman Empire entirely. Things like the Icknield Way and the various different green roads, which are prehistoric and were still in use in the medieval period, of course. Now, these are little more than trackways, kind of worn into the ground by the passage of chariots, potentially, in the Iron Age, or most likely feet and hooves, mostly. And those were very variable in quality, as you can imagine, and varied vastly depending on the weather and the geography. There are places in the uplands which were fairly well drained, which would have been more or less navigable reasonably well in whatever the weather was and whatever season it was. Other places in the lowlands would have got very, very muddy indeed. And it's one of the reasons why a lot of travel was almost completely seasonal. You just didn't travel for pleasure anyway, or really for work if you could avoid it in the winter. It was just dramatically harder. There were maintained roads in the medieval period. These were typically in towns and cities, and usually in the central areas where people had more footfall and where there was more money. There's a greater concentration of money, and sometimes local towns and local cities raised temporary taxes or temporary tolls called paviers, which would allow them to spend the money communally and pave the town square or pave the main street. This was designed to encourage commerce and tidy things up and bring a bit of civilization to the town. So the idea of your civic pride having a paved town square was very, very much a thing in the medieval period. And we have complaints about people saying we've paid too many tolls for the paving, and the paving's not been done very well. Is the other thing. The quality of the paving was quite variable, depending on who you actually got to do it and what systems were used. There were paviors guilds, but not everybody was a member of a paviors guild. You might just go for the cheapest option possible, and then you just slam the slabs down over the mud, and it wouldn't last very long. There were a handful of better quality roads in the medieval period. These were called the King's Highways, the King's Road. And from around the 12th century, they were required to be maintained by local people to a higher quality than ordinary everyday roads. They were specifically set out as needed for commerce and for infrastructure. They weren't necessarily that well maintained in all places, but they were strategic, much like the Roman roads before them. These were strategic, and there are some still in existence today. So, for example, the A1, the Great North Road, is a King's Highway back then, and still follows the same path more or less. And the road from London to Dover, very strategically important, was also a King's Highway. You were supposed to have more rights on those roads, and it was forbidden to block them or to put temporary tolls on them unless by order of the authorities correctly. And they had to be maintained for safety as well. The Statute of Winchester in 1285 specifically mentions clearing to one side or the other to prevent robbers and bad people from attacking travellers. So it must have happened, because you wouldn't put that in the law unless it was meaningful. The exact quote is, "Highways leading from one market town to another shall be enlarged, whereas woods, hedges, or dykes be, so that there be neither dyke, underwood, nor bush, whereby a man may lurk to do hurt near to the way, within 200 foot of the one side, and 200 foot on the other side." It's very specific, and 200 feet is a decent bow shot as well. I mean, that's very specific, and arguably indicates that it was a threat from robbers lurking around in the bushes next to the road. And 200 feet is a decent bow shot as well, so you're going to see 200 feet that way, 200 feet that way. It's a fairly substantial amount of clearance that went on. I bet it wasn't always maintained that way though, but perhaps when the king was going to pass by, then they charged out there and cut the undergrowth down. So you've been traveling for a while, you marched the whole day with maybe a pack on your back, your goods. You need a place to stay overnight. Medieval people generally didn't do wild camping in the way that adventurers might do in fantasy campaigns, or in Lord of the Rings, the hobbits stayed over wrapped in blankets. That was rare. It must have happened, of course, but it was fairly rare. People typically went from one place to another and knew where they were going to stay. They'd have stayed in a local inn if they had money, or if they didn't have money, they'd stay somewhere else. Let's go inside and get out of the weather and explain. In the 12th century, people were beginning to travel a bit more. There was a bit more travel for pleasure. There was a lot more commerce. Towns and cities were expanding. Inns became a thing. Now, some of those were quite fancy and would cost you reasonable amounts of money. They weren't modest accommodations sometimes. But if you were traveling on business, that was part of the deal. If, however, you were traveling for pleasure, or you were on pilgrimage and you just didn't want to spend much money, camping wasn't really an option. I suppose it could be, but it was potentially a bit dangerous and not very comfortable. You could go to a religious institution. Monasteries, in particular, had an obligation to look after the poor. The weary traveller is part of it. They often had specific separate accommodation for travellers, especially on well-known pilgrimage routes. So on the way to Canterbury, for example, in England, or the Santiago de Compostela route. Those institutions were set up to cater for the traveller, normally on pilgrimage, but not always on pilgrimage. They often charged, well, they didn't really charge money. They accepted donations. If you wanted to stay there, they would give you modest food and drink, sometimes a small bit of beer and a small loaf of bread called the dole. In England anyway, being on the dole is to be unemployed. So, and that's come from that medieval practice of doling out charitable food and drink, and provide modest accommodation for visitors. A lot of these religious institutions had specific rules about how to look after the traveller. In the 13th century, specific hospices had started to develop, particularly in places like the Alps, where travel over the mountain ranges was dangerous. These specific hospices, or hospitiums, were managed by the religious institutions. And also they started to develop almshouses as well, outside of the pilgrimage routes, specific places for people to receive charitable food and lodging sometimes. There's a 13th century set of rules called a customary from the Abbey of Cluny in France, and it instructs monks to greet guests with humility. And it specifically says, the prior or the monk assigned shall go out to meet the guests with all reverence, bowing and saying a prayer, for we do not know in what manner our Lord will visit us. I think that's quite interesting. They were reflecting hospitality as if Christ himself would turn up. I think that's rather lovely. Food was also described as it should be sufficient but modest, which I guess makes sense. You should not be hungry, but it's not going to be fancy pants food. It said, let the guest be served what is prepared without waste, but with ample charity, so that none should leave hungry or in want. That's quite sweet. But it also says, at the table, let nothing be spoken unless it be necessary, so that the mind be nourished by listening to the word of God, whilst the body is sustained by food. So they didn't really want idle chit-chat over dinner at all. They didn't want to disturb the sanctity of the monastery. But they also didn't have a vow of silence in this particular order, so they would speak where it was necessary. And I do wonder what kind of conversations would be had from pilgrims to monks, but it's wonderful. There is a 9th century manuscript that talks about the monk who speaks with a guest shall give him comfort and counsel as fits the journey ahead, but let him not speak idle words, for the monastery is a place of prayer. So obviously you could give advice, I presume. You could tell the traveller what was coming up and what might be dangerous or what the weather was likely to be or whether there'd been landslides or anything like that. But you weren't supposed to just chit-chat and jibber-jabber idly. So again, very strict rules to try to keep decorum in place and keep things sanctified. The other thing that's interesting is that decent behavior was expected from guests. I guess this applies to hotels today and all sorts of places. You're expected to behave with a certain level of decorum. But it specifically writes this down, and it says, "Let the guest conduct himself in quietness with gratitude, that the peace of the brothers be not disturbed, and he shall retire to his room by dusk." So as lights out, as the sun goes down, you go to your room and you go to sleep. That was what was expected of guests visiting these particular institutions. And it says, when the guests depart the next day, presumably first light, I don't know, dawn makes sense. I suppose you want to make the best of your traveling the next day. You have specific instructions. Peter the Venerable, Abbot of Cluny, suggests that guests are waved goodbye effectively. We send each guest in peace with a prayer for safe travels and a gift, if God has blessed us with abundance, for he leaves as our brother. That's rather sweet, isn't it? I think it shows that they were deliberately caring for their guests and trying to make the stay an example of holy charity and not turn it into a rowdy inn. So subtle difference there, not a subtle difference, an unsubtle difference between what might have been expected at an inn with drinking and carousing and music and going to stay at a monastery or equivalent. One was very sober and one was, I suppose it would depend on the clientele. Paperwork was actually a thing in the medieval times. Towards the end of the medieval period, there were so many pilgrims that they needed to start to have a little bit of paperwork. And these were often as simple as their name, where they were from, where they were going, the rough route they were supposed to take, and maybe the sort of signature of the local parish priest or bishop that had given them permission to go on pilgrimage. These were necessary because there were fake pilgrims. I'll get into that in a little bit. But passports as such, the way we understand them in the modern day, passports which would be issued were not specifically a thing in the same way they are today. You would have a passport if you were a member of the diplomatic kind of crew, if you like, traveling to, say, somebody from England wanted to visit the court of France. The court of France would give you safe passage, would give you paperwork that would say you were under their protection if you wanted to go. And these were the equivalent of diplomatic passports. So they did exist, but they were very high end. They were for extremely important travelers, not the ordinary person. Sometimes the actual paperwork that a pilgrim might need to keep with them would be stamped at certain places along the way, partly as proof of doing the pilgrimage and partly, I suppose, as a sort of bit of a souvenir. I don't know whether you got to keep your travel papers when you got back or whether they had to be handed in somehow, but I like the idea of people collecting little stamps on the way to their final destination as proof that they'd actually done their devotional journey. Towards the end of the medieval period, there were so many pilgrims travelling hither and yon that big places started to actually have pilgrimage police. They actually had officials whose job was to check the credentials and paperwork of pilgrims. Now, one of the reasons people pretended to be pilgrims was they were potentially more protected in their travels. You don't want to attack religious people on their journey. You might get the wrath of God on you. They did get attacked, of course, and they often travelled in bands, but there's some principle there. Towards the end of the medieval period, there started to be pilgrimage police. There were so many people travelling on pilgrimage that they needed a system to check credentials and check people were genuine. One of the reasons for people pretending to be a pilgrim was that tolls were often reduced or non-existent. You didn't have to pay transport taxes. You weren't necessarily searched so much for customs. So smuggling, pretending to be a pilgrim and smuggling was probably a bit easier. And also you got free food and lodging if you knew where to go, or certainly very reduced food and lodging. So there was a temptation to pretend to be a pilgrim. And of course, if you were out on nefarious purposes, you could travel in a group of pilgrims and sort of hide in plain sight. Pilgrims often wore specific types of clothes, specific types of hats with pilgrimage badges, and they sort of had a way of looking, so people would generally recognize them as a separate group from an ordinary merchant, for example, merchant traveler, which meant it was quite a good disguise because people would assume pilgrims were not up to bad things. So if you could disguise yourself as a pilgrim, you could probably get away with an awful lot more. So pilgrimage police were a thing, especially places like Paris and I presume Rome, some of the more major places needed to have security, but they also needed to have some kind of system to prevent abuse of the pilgrimage system. The other thing is customs. So if you were bringing back spices from your travels to Jerusalem, for example, which would be very tempting because they're very, very valuable. So a small sack of spice, if you could smuggle it home, you'd probably make a small fortune selling it. There were customs to pay along the way, and because pilgrims were not necessarily taxed in the same way and possibly not scrutinized in the same way, there's a temptation to disguise your smuggling as a pilgrim. And also there was a thing called pious smuggling. There's pious theft, but pious smuggling. So if you had been sold a fragment of the true cross, for example, you needed to pay tax on that when you brought it back home. But obviously, if you didn't tell anybody you were smuggling a piece of the true cross, you didn't pay tax on it. And so there was a temptation for people to not declare their souvenirs, their relics, as they traveled. And I don't know what that does to the morals of the situation. If you genuinely had a piece of the true cross and you didn't want to pay tax bringing it back from the Holy Land, where does that put you in terms of religious behavior? I'm not sure, but it's a really fascinating snapshot. People obviously didn't want to pay tax then, they don't want to pay tax today, but they were supposed to. And I guess many of them did, but I guess many of them didn't as well. So pilgrims traveling back from their pilgrimage, smuggling goods, was a thing that was done sufficiently for the authorities to take steps to prevent it. In summary then, medieval travel was very possible, but it was slow and deliberate. You needed to know what you were doing. Language was going to be a potential problem. There were actually guidebooks. There were guidebooks for merchants to look at the coinage they might use and what the value of each coin was relative to another coin. And I imagine there were very simple language guidebooks as well, how to ask for the local inn, how to ask for the local monastery, how to ask for help. We don't have many of those as a record, but there were definitely medieval guidebooks. And one is really interesting because this particular individual names certain places that he had a bad experience in, and certain specific people are called out as going to cheat you or sell you bad food. I think that's absolutely extraordinary representation of somebody's memory of a journey that was obviously important to them, but they got done over a little bit and they wrote it down in the guidebook. There's a Codex Calixtinus, which was a 12th century guide to the Santiago de Compostela, that particular pilgrimage route. And it highlights places that are dangerous for pilgrims to travel through, so rush through or travel in a group. And it also suggests places to avoid because they will cheat you and serve you bad food. So the idea of a travel guide is certainly medieval and probably goes back way beyond. We know from medieval records
Alchemy is balance. Too much light blindeth as surely as darkness.
We must find Naz. Thou mayest go. Thy bounty yet remaineth.
Alchemy is balance. Too much light blindeth as surely as darkness.
records that kings, either with their entourage or without it, managed a whole range of different distances in a day's travel on horseback. In January 1300, a 60-year-old Edward I, complete with his whole court, managed to travel an average of 19 miles a day. Now, that's in the winter, and remember, in January there's only 9 hours roughly of daylight, and allowing for 2 hours of rest stops and meals doesn't give him that long to travel that distance. I wonder how fast he was going. Let's do some experiments and find out. It's an incredibly blustery day here, but it's still fine enough to do some research. So I'm going to put one of these stakes here in the beginning, and then I'm going to walk out at a sensible speed the half mile that I've measured on an aerial map. Now, obviously a lot of these measurements and these timings are going to be necessarily averaged out and probably a bit rough, but I think it gives a good indication of the kind of speed that King Edward III must have been travelling at. So there's the start point, and I'm going to walk the half mile down that way, not at any particular speed, and then I'm going to come back and we're going to try it again several times. So I am going to set off in a straight line all the way to that long distant line of trees and time it just at an ordinary walk. It's half a mile according to my satellite view, and we'll see. Here we go. Walk on. Good boy. 46 seconds. 11 minutes 30 seconds. Good boy. 12 minutes. Stop. 12 minutes 44 seconds to go there and back. Actually, that wasn't very difficult. That's just a casual, comfortable rate of walking on a horse. You could probably do that in reasonably suboptimal conditions, and I don't think at the end of the day you'd be particularly tired. That's a sort of nice, comfortable pottering along through the landscape, enjoying it and not rushing. So 19 miles in a day is relatively easy to do if you're mounted. But what if the king was in a state of national emergency and needed to travel really quickly from one place to the other? How fast could he actually travel in medieval times? In complete contrast to Edward I's more casual ride across the country, a younger Edward III in 1336 in September, so sort of the beginning of winter, travelled 380 miles in a maximum of 7 days. So by my calculations, that's roughly 55 miles a day. He wasn't encumbered with his court, he was travelling with a small retinue and he was trying to go quickly. How fast would you have to actually ride to achieve that kind of distance? 55 miles in a day is a lot more than 19 miles in a day. Now, we don't know how many hours in the day he rode for, but it's obviously got to be a reasonable length of time because it's remarkable, because it's written down. So the question I'm asking is, what speed do you have to go on horseback to cover 55 miles a day for several days? I think it's going to be reasonably fast, but it's definitely not a canter or a gallop, because a horse will be blown after a short while doing that. It's going to have to be a walk and a trot. Now, of course, medieval horses did other paces like ambling and pacing, but I don't have an ambler or a pacer in my yard, so we're going to have to rely on Warlord here, and we're going to see how long it takes me to cover half a mile at the speed I think you have to maintain for probably 8 to 10 hours in a day to travel 55 miles. Come on, steady now. Now walk. That was very brisk indeed. That was a bit of trotting, a bit of walking, but doing that for 10 hours in the day would be extremely tiring. 9 minutes 53 seconds. Warlord is raring to go because he's been pushed on. Of course, he wouldn't have this much energy after 55 miles of this. So 9 minutes 52, near enough, 9 minutes 53 seconds. That is the sort of speed he would have needed to maintain to cover 55 miles in one day. That's pretty rapid riding. That was actually very interesting. I had to push Warlord on quite rapidly. I had to kind of make the time work. I had to walk briskly, but also trot and a bit of jig jogging along the way. So I felt like I was rushing the whole time. Yes, I was trying to hit a specific timeline for a specific journey, but if you were pushing on, if you were Edward III and you were rushing to travel a distance across England, you would have needed to push on. So somebody would have been driving that small group of men and horses as they rode through the landscape, because you'd have to keep going, you have to keep jig jogging, you have to keep pushing on. You rest for a little bit by walking briskly, and then you go, right, everybody, let's trot for 5 minutes, now back down into a walk. So it's not an easy or comfortable pace to maintain, and doing it for 7 days in a row, possibly even faster. We don't really know exactly how much he would have travelled each day. It would have required quite a lot of discipline, and I imagine there were more than a few sore bodies at the end of each day. Good morning, everybody. I am out in the fields today because I have a set of questions I need answering. I've been doing a lot of research into medieval travel, and there are a couple of questions that I'm not satisfied that I've found the answers to. So I'm going to measure out 100 yards and use these sticks and do some experimenting like a good historical scientist. Let's go and put the first stake in the ground and then measure 100 yards from that. The experiment I'm going to do involves moving on rough ground because I think it will give us some interesting insight into the difference between travelling on foot and travelling on a horse. So I'm going to mark one area here, then I'm going to use this tape to measure 100 yards. That'll do as the beginning point. Let's tie this off roughly. I think this tape is actually 50 yards long, might even be in meters, but I'm going to use yards because it's more medieval. I could probably use chains or furlongs or some other equally obscure measurement. Right, I think this will take us to, how are we now? 165 feet. So, right, it's 165 feet. Let's go twice that distance to make it a bit more scientific. Although any experiment like this is necessarily going to have quite big error margins. Ideally, I suppose we do this measurement over, I don't know, let's say a mile cross country. So I'm just going to move this all the way and measure it again. So that was 165 feet. About here, this tree is a lovely cherry tree. So that is about 330 feet, so 110 yards, but it's the longest we could do with this tape, and the longer distance we do the experiment for, arguably the more accurate the results will be. Interestingly, in medieval times, a lot of the measurements were not standardized. Some of you may have seen the market yards on the side of old churches. That was so that you could prove to a cloth merchant that they were selling you not enough cloth or too much. So the idea of having standardized measurements across a nation, or in fact just a standardized measurement, was completely unknown. The yard was considered to be the length between the tip of the nose of the reigning monarch and his outstretched or her outstretched fingers, which of course is a very variable measurement, especially if the king's or queen is quite young. But there were measurements that were used regularly throughout the building of cathedrals, for example, and those were standardized to a rod, and the master mason would have the rod that was going to be used. And that means that every cathedral's slightly different in its dimensions, because the rod was the piece of set measurement that was used by the whole building site, and that would vary from master mason to master mason. So standardized measurements, you were never really sure what you were going to get if you were buying a yard of cloth from one town to the next. Right, and I am going to walk at a pace I think I could maintain for a long time when carrying a moderate amount of weight, as if simulating me, a peasant, walking to the local fair. So let's time this. 330 yards, go. It probably seems a bit slower than you might expect, but for the purposes of the experiment, I'm trying to simulate somebody actually not rushing, just going at a sensible working pace for a long period of time. 1 minute 17 seconds, 2 minutes to go there and back, coming along, not rushing. 2 minutes 25 seconds to walk there and back. So that's 330 yards, 660 yards in 2 minutes 25 seconds. Now, that's on foot, and it's across reasonably okay grassland. It's not wet, it's not muddy, it's not a proper road though. Obviously in the medieval times there were lots of old Roman roads still being used, but there were also greenways and there were more rural ways. So this is going to be a very, very broad brushstrokes average. So what I want to do now is go and get on Warlord and try the same thing on him in a walk. Obviously horses can go faster than a walking human being, but I want to see what kind of speed you could go on the back of a horse, with the principle being you're not rushing, you're just sitting on a horse and walking to market mounted. I want to see whether it's more efficient. I think it'd probably be easier because you'll be sitting there. I want to see whether it's faster as well. So let's go and get on Warlord and try the next part of the experiment. Good lad. Right, I've got Warlord ready. Just grabbed him out of the stable, made sure he's groomed and he's ready to go. So he's not been warmed up particularly because I want to simulate the idea of just getting on a horse and going for a ride. I think that he'll be faster than I am on foot, and I'm just going to go at a sensible pace. I'm not going to push him forwards at a fast walk, just going to have him go at a sensible speed, the sort of speed that you might just be relaxedly riding to market instead of walking to market. Obviously it's going to mean less effort for me because I'm not using my own legs. Riding does take up energy though, so it isn't completely free to do. Let's go and see how the timing works out. Right, let's go to the start point and do the experiment. Start. I am not urging him on, I'm just guiding him, so he's walking at his normal speed. Obviously, horses would differ hugely in the speed at which they walked, but the horses that walked quickly would probably have been favoured. Good boy. Good boy, walk on. Halfway, 33 seconds. Oh, no, jig jogging. No, you'll spoil the experiment. Good boy. Oh, good boy. You're faster when you walk anyway. 2 minutes. 2 minutes for that. Lots of jig jogging there. Now that jig jogging actually isn't faster than walking. He just goes up and down more than going forwards. So it's a bit annoying. So maybe we will discount that last run, that last bit on the way home. That's another thing with horses, they kind of know their geography, and he knows that way is back home and that way is away from home. They go different speeds depending on which way they're going. And I'm now going to just tidy up the stakes because this is fun to do. Good boy. Good boy. Come on, Warlord, steady now. Hey, steady, steady, steady. Come on, it's up. Good boy. I tell you what, it's much quicker to tidy up the stakes on horseback than it was to put them out when I was on foot. So clearly at top speed horses are much more efficient than people running, but that wasn't the experiment today. But I'm going to go and take these back, get off Warlord, and then we'll do some thinking and some calculations and compare people on foot and people mounted. I'm going to use very, very averaged figures because it's an initial experiment and we're not looking for precision, we're looking for general principles here. So for me to walk that distance on foot was about 2 minutes 30 seconds and on horse, with all the issues about Warlord going a little bit too fast at the end, was about 2 minutes. So you're saving 30 seconds, which over that length of distance isn't particularly significant, but it's about a fifth faster on horseback than it is on foot. And obviously if you were carrying a load, it would be an awful lot easier because the horse would be carrying that load, and at the end of the journey you'd probably be feeling a little bit less tired if you'd been riding on horseback. Which is why horses were used. If you had them, you travelled on horseback. It was faster and it was easier, which is the thing that balances out the cost and maintenance of having a horse. It's a very hot July day here in the centre of England. I'm not going to do any weapons training today. It's just too hot for me and, more importantly, hot for horses. So I'm going to go for a ride on Talos through the woods. The woods are, I think, noticeably colder, but we will see when we get there. Just being in the shade though reduces the temperature from, well, around sort of 37 degrees centigrade to much more manageable 25, 26 degrees centigrade when you're not in the direct sunshine. Let's see how that goes. We have to be very careful not to do too much overheating work, especially with an enormous horse like Talos, who's half Shire, half Andalusian, which makes him a Kingslander. He's a very rare type of horse actually. His size means he overheats quite dramatically. He's definitely not built for speed, he's built for strength. We want to be careful with our horsey colleagues. Good boy. You can see in the background, good boy, some bales of hay, which are going to be the food. His food in the winter. Right now, I don't think anybody's very hungry. Good boy, let's go into the woods. Come on, good lad. It is significantly cooler in the woods, which is rather nice. Just the amount of leaf cover makes the atmosphere very, very pleasant indeed. I think it's probably dropped about 10 degrees. Still warm. You wouldn't want to do too much hard work if you could avoid it, but it is delightful. So tree cover and vegetation dramatically reduces the amount of heat that hits the ground for human life, or animal life for that matter. Plant more trees and you reduce the albedo of the earth, absorb more energy, absorb more carbon dioxide, and quite frankly make a more pleasant environment to walk in on a hot summer's day. Most woodland was heavily managed in the medieval period, and of course the enclosures, the idea of the English countryside that is hedges and small fields, was a post-medieval invention, change in the landscape, which caused quite a lot of controversy actually, and the Peasants' Revolt was partly stimulated by low wages and changing social landscape. But then the Enclosures Act come in much later and reduce the amount of land available for ordinary people to farm. The medieval landscape would have been very different to the English landscape we see today. There would not have been so many hedges. There were hedges, but they were typically around farms and small holdings, and designed really to keep pigs in and keep sheep in and that kind of stuff. But the main growing was done in great fields, which would be divided into strips of land, which would be, in some cases, rotated through people, and certain people would have a certain number of strips, and they would change depending on circumstances. So there was a sense of community fairness. Now, I'm not sure it was that fair, but there certainly appears to be a sense of understanding of fairness and the rules, and people were fined if they ploughed outside the land or in the wrong place, or made the bits of common land which were in between where you could get to your strip of land to do the job. If you blocked those with wood or bits and bobs of everyday detritus. So, and it still happens. There's a place called Laxton in England which still operates the 3-field rotation system, the Great Fields, and that is well worth a visit if you ever get a chance. The landscape is very different to what people expect and think of as English landscape. We've been talking a lot about medieval travel on horseback. One of the things that I'm always curious about is, how did medieval people see the world? I am lucky enough to be the guest of Hereford Cathedral, and they have kindly allowed me to stand in front of one of the biggest medieval mappa mundis that is in existence anymore. We don't know how many of these might have existed back in the day, but this is certainly amongst the oldest maps of the world in existence. It is an interesting thing because it is on one huge piece of vellum, and that calf itself, sad thing, was probably bred specifically to be used as this map. So you have the life of one animal represented here, but it's still being preserved, and it's behind armoured glass, and it's protected in a special kind of atmosphere so that it can last for another 1,000 years. But what's particularly interesting is it isn't just a geographical map. It's a map that represents the mind of the medieval person. One of the things that I find particularly interesting about this is, because Jerusalem is in the centre and the rest of the world, the known world as far as medieval Europeans were concerned, was Europe, Africa and Asia, somebody stuck a pin in the middle there, drawn Jerusalem, because Jerusalem had to be in the middle, which of course for the Christian world was the centre of the world, and then drawn the circumference of the map, which I bet they did with a big piece of wood or a piece of string, drew around that, and then set about filling in the details. And then as you go up on this map, which is east, you get to Eden and Christ on his throne in heaven. When you first look at this beautiful piece of artwork, you'll actually see that there's not a lot of geographical accuracy in it. The British Isles are not really shaped like that. Sort of vaguely are if you squint and close your eyes funnily. And the details are, they're not accurate in the way that we might think of a modern map today, not a satellite view as such, but it's more of a mental map of physical places. The rivers are in roughly the right kind of place. The Mediterranean is here, you've got big islands, you've got the labyrinth. And this is where you start to see aspects of mythology as well as religion overlaid on this map. So this map in many ways represents the fact that the medieval mind didn't think of myth and legend as separate from reality, because they're all there. You have the unicorn, and you have, interestingly, a rhinoceros as well. So unicorn and rhinoceros in the same place. So this whole thing shows that the medieval artist wasn't that bothered about the representation of physical reality, but this is a representation of spiritual and emotional reality that is the medieval world. This is what they thought reality was, with all of the many layers of myth, legend, religion, and geography, as well as elements from the classical world. So there are echoes from the very long distant past here, as well as signs of the future, signs of redemption and the eventual destruction of everything that the medieval person knew. One of the mysteries of this map itself, or rather this picture, because it's not really a map, I don't think it's fair to call it a map, I think it's bigger than just a map, is its actual data construction. We know that an individual drew it, and we know roughly when it was created because we have clues like Conway and Carnarvon Castle down here are illustrated on the map, and they were built in the 1290s roughly, and we have ideas from the style of the artwork and the style of the lettering. So the figure of Christ here in a particularly sort of slightly awkward S shape isn't really seen in England until about the 1280s, 1290s. So, and then it becomes very common in the 1300s, 1310s. So we know it's around that style. And the lettering, we actually think we might know the actual scribe who wrote the letters, not necessarily drew the illustrations, but wrote the letters, because there's another book that is apparently in a very similar style of hand lettering. Today the Mappa Mundi itself in Hereford Cathedral is kept in conditions that maintain its integrity, but for much of its life it was out on display in the main cathedral, available for people to touch, available for people to see, and available for the sunlight to fall on it. So it has faded quite a lot. This, when it was originally made, would have been brightly coloured in the way that manuscript illustrations are in books, but where books are kept folded and hidden away, this was on display. So everything that could fade has faded. So for example, the rivers would have been in blue or green, and the sea, the Mediterranean and the Aegean itself would have been bright blue. We know there's a lot of red lettering on it as well, and the blue is an important component of colour in the medieval period because there were different types of blue. Some blues were very, very rare and expensive, and they were made of lapis lazuli all the way from Afghanistan, and other types of blue were from azurite, which is a more available, it's copper ore, it's more easily available. So different blues represented different wealths, and one of the fascinating things for me is that the words of Christ himself are shown in blue ink, and I bet you that's the most expensive blue ink available. Along with bright colours, this thing would have been gilded. There are, if you catch the light right, you can see some of the letters are coloured in with real gold, and some of the places themselves have got golden elements to them, and even the golden fleece up here has probably got gold flecks on it. So when this was originally in place, when it was a centre of both a religious and a tourist experience, it must have been very grand. It must have been very brightly coloured, and bright colours and the cacophony and chaos of colours were very attractive to the medieval mind. The inside of cathedrals were often very brightly painted themselves. What we see today is a pale imitation of how they would have looked, especially because of the Reformation in the church, especially in England. But bright colours were a component of the factor that would have drawn people to see this mind map of the medieval world. You have an awful lot of geography down here. This is these are the British Isles here, with places mentioned. London, Hereford itself is mentioned and is slightly blurred on this because lots of people say that people were touching it